Hello, everybody. Happy New Year. Happy 2025. What kind of year it's going to be? According to the Washington Post, 2025 promises to be what it calls tumultuous, and I tend to agree with that. Lots of potential innovation. Of course, new administration in Washington, D.C., lots of promise, lots of fear about this new Trump administration. One interesting piece that caught my eye recently in the Wall Street Journal was co-authored by an old friend of mine, Larry Downs. Who needs 1,000 Social Security offices? It's an interesting op-ed about the need to reform Washington, D.C., to automate it, to drag Washington, D.C. and the federal bureaucracy into the digital revolution. It would seem to be low-hanging fruit for the Doge team. Larry Downs is joining us from just over the bay in Berkeley, California. Larry, do you agree with the Post that 2025 is going to be tumultuous?
I think that's I actually think that's a really good word for it. Absolutely. I can't predict, and I've been predicting things for a long time. This is one I'm not even going to, take a stab at. I would never make any predictions about what's going to happen in the coming year. It really is, anything is possible.
Larry, you've been writing about innovation for many years. You authored the first book really on the digital revolution, Unleashing the Killer App. Your last book is Pivot to the Future. So you're an authority on innovation. Do you get the sense that this incoming Trump administration is genuine about innovation? A lot of people say, well, they're just saying that to pursue their own interests. Trump wants to be the new monarch. Musk is trying to make himself richer. But do you think there's some potential there? Is there any genuine quality to their need for their promise to reform the world, and particularly American government?
Well, the building blocks are there. I can't speak to how serious they are, and I think, when we were researching the Wall Street Journal piece you mentioned, we did come across a nice article in the Washington Post that sort of went through all the tweets from the two principals of Doge, and a lot of them really didn't suggest they were very serious about it. There was one Ramaswamy was saying, one way to fix Social Security is if your Social Security number ends in 0, you're out, and if your ends in 1, you're in, and that would say
you're in and out of what?
Of getting Social Security.
So it becomes a lottery.
Well, yeah, and half the people don't get it, and half the people do.
That's going to be a big vote winner.
And
again, guarantee that you lose 50% of your votes overnight.
Right. So, but was that even serious? Do they have a serious plan? Do they have any authority to do anything, even if they are serious? It's hard to say. A lot of the people who have been named for the real White House positions, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the National Economic Council, the National Economic Advisors, and so on, they're people who have been in the administration before. The new head of the antitrust division at DOJ is someone who's been in the previous Trump administration. So they do have some seasoned folks who are coming back, who know how things actually do or don't work in Washington. So that may be where the actual innovation or reform takes place, not so much maybe in these more vocal outsiders.
You're also a keen observer of politics in Washington, D.C. Brendan Carr is the new head of the FCC. Again, a lot of fear about him. Apparently wrote the FCC chapter in Project 2025. Lots of claims that he wants to shut mainstream media down. He's made some comments on it. Do you expect Carr and the FCC to radically change the media landscape in 2025 onwards?
I don't. I think for two reasons. One of which is, it's not really, again, a conservative agenda really wouldn't, make big changes, even though, yes, they don't like the liberal media. But the reality is they're also, sort of playing that against a general conservative view that speech should be left alone. But the more important reason I think not much is going to happen at the FCC is they just don't really have the authority. And incoming Chairman Carr knows this. He's been at the FCC a long time. He was a He was a staffer before that in Congress. He knows telecom law extremely well. The reality is the FCC has very little authority when it comes to, certainly anything but broadcast. That's the only place they have authority in media. But even over broadcast media, for example, you can talk about, as they have, sort of challenging the licenses of ABC, NBC, CBS. But the reality is ABC doesn't have any licenses. ABC is a network. The individual affiliates have licenses, and you certainly can affect the licenses of the individual affiliates, although again, the authority of how you can do that and when you can do that is very limited. But you literally can't pull the license of ABC because ABC doesn't have a license.
Yeah, and there's a particular irony to the general hysteria about networks like ABC and NBC because their significance is in such radical decline. I mean, most of the power of media now is in new media, in podcasters like Joe Rogan, obviously on platforms like X and Instagram.
Yeah.
So I'm not even convinced that even if he had some success in shutting down or tampering with ABC or NBC, it would make a great deal of difference.
No, I think that's right. I mean, the streaming revolution is not even finished or not even close to being finished, but it's clearly changed the landscape, as you say. And it's interesting that of course, a lot of the reporting we're getting about the media industry is from the old media, and either they don't see or they don't want to see that they're not as influential or as important as they used to be. So for them, everything is apocalyptic because they only see their own little shrinking world.
Do you think I want to come to your ideas on reforming the government in a second, but do you think that the media did a good job reporting on the 2024 election and on the Biden administration? My concern is that they did a lot of self-editing when it came to Biden himself. They also tried, I think, to be less hysterical about Trump. It would be interesting to see in 2025 whether that old hysteria will reappear.
Yeah. The Trump derangement syndrome, I think, is what was referred to back in the first administration. Yeah, I don't know. I honestly, Andrew, I don't spend a lot of time with mainstream media for the reasons you suggest. I've even, more or less turned off NPR.
Oh dear, when NPR loses Larry Downs, it's in trouble. On the other hand, Larry, you're still writing for mainstream media. Who needs 1,000 Social Security offices in the Wall Street Journal? I think you've had hundreds of responses, so you must have some value for it.
Yeah, I'm definitely a contradiction. I am very, and I'm publishing books with publishers instead of going through my own channels and so on. Yeah, I'm a contradiction. I can't deny that.
Well, we all are, like myself. So talk to me about your thinking behind who needs 1,000 Social Security offices. I found it a particularly interesting piece. I didn't realize that and I'm quoting you here, more than 85% of the government's 3 million workers are based outside Washington. What's your point about that?
Well, I think that came from originally that when the Doge folks started talking, they it was all about draining the swamp and getting rid of federal workers inside Washington. And a couple of points were made by different reporters that they didn't seem to realize that most of the federal government isn't in Washington, D.C. So we picked up on that and said, yes, what do those 3 million people do outside of Washington, D.C.? Where are they? What are they doing? And does it make any sense? Is there actually a real opportunity, if you're serious about reform, if you're serious about improving government services, is there an opportunity outside of Washington where inside Washington isn't really all that interesting?
The immediate response would be, who needs 1,000 Social Security offices? Certainly Social Security workers. How many jobs are we talking about? How many million jobs? Yeah, if we got 3 million workers are based outside Washington, D.C., we're talking about 3 million jobs, Larry. That's not chopped liver when it comes to employment.
No, it's not. It's not at all. Obviously, the federal government is a major employer. And I think our thinking was, You would save, obviously closing a lot of offices that are unnecessary for various reasons. Obviously, a lot of the savings would come from real estate and utilities and so on. But yes, it would be a very significant impact on the labor market. Not all those people would lose their jobs, but a lot of people would. A lot of federal workers would lose their jobs if you really got serious about moving to e-government.
And you talk about e-government. This is not an AI initiative, although I'm sure AI would play a role.
Yeah.
This is e-government. This is replacing Social Security officers, workers, and Social Security offices with an online initiative. Explain what you mean by it.
Sure. I mean, and again, it's not a new idea at all. We've been talking about e-government since we started talking about e-business, which would have been, 25 years ago. And even as long ago as the 2010 National Broadband Plan, which my co-author Blair Levin was the principal director and author of, there were all sorts of ideas about, well, how can we get government to people in a more effective way, get it to them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, get it to them where they are. They don't have to come into an office, wait in line, wait to get an appointment, and so on, and still get them better information because it's all computerized. Obviously, this has happened in the private sector to a great extent, but there's been almost nothing in government services. Very little you can do online, and what you can do doesn't work very well. It's really way behind.
So what do most people do in Social Security offices? Collect Social Security payments, inquire. What's the business of the Social Security office?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, while researching this piece, I thought, well, let's find out. And so I tried, and actually, I'll out myself here. I turned 65 last year, so I'm now a Medicare, and I had a question about Social Security and Medicare, and I called Medicare, and they told me to call Social Security, and I tried to call the Social Security office, and the first thing they tell you when you call is there's a 3-hour hold time to speak to somebody. So I thought, well, I better make an appointment then and go to my
but better chance in the DMV.
Right. And so I thought, I'll make an appointment and go to, first of all, the system doesn't allow you to make an appointment. And so you'd have to just show up and hope that you're not waiting there for hours. But yeah, I think it's a lot of it is people still picking up their checks, filling out forms, asking questions, Medicare related stuff. A lot of that happens at the Social Security office. And I think a lot of these offices, in busy inner city areas, they're very crowded. But my guess is that if you went out to Fargo, North Dakota, that office probably isn't very busy.
And you quote a McKinsey report that suggests that users, and this is astonishing, user satisfaction with federal government services is at 12%. In other words, just over 1 in 10 people are satisfied with federal government. Why aren't they? Is it because they're having to wait 3 hours on the phone to ask a basic question
and not get an answer? Yeah. Government services, and I don't want to dump on the federal civil service here. I think they are hamstrung in a lot of ways. Again, they do not have the kinds of computer systems, even internally, to use, that I think they can get the information that you need. So if you come in and you ask a question, it's not like they can just type on a keyboard and give you the answer, looking up your file or looking up the proper regulations. They don't have the tools they need to do a good job. And so, you just get terrible service. Again, it's delays. It's being passed from one agency, one office to another, being told you called the wrong place, you filled out the wrong form, you haven't filled it out correctly. It gets lost. It doesn't happen. And it's not a big surprise when you don't have the IT systems that the private enterprise has. The best you can do is lousy service, but probably what you're going to get is incredibly bad service.
Although some people might be uncomfortable with the idea of private service. I mean, the American healthcare system is supposedly privatized, although it's a kind of monopolistic privatization. Of course, one of the big stories of 2024 was the assassination of a senior healthcare official by a disgruntled American citizen. Can we guarantee that the privatization, or quote unquote privatization, of some of these government initiatives would actually result in a more accountable or efficient system?
Right. So two things. First of all, we're not talking about privatization.
No,
In
I realize that. But go
we're
on,
just
sorry.
we're just keeping it good. Just increasing the IT component. But second of all, this is a question about incremental improvement. If you're at 12%, it's how much worse can it get? If you're getting user satisfaction ratings that are worse than you get from calling your health insurer, your car insurer, or the local electrical utility, uh, in some ways it can't get any worse.
Well, it could get to 1%. I mean, 12%.
um,
But all these services, Larry, I mean, the insurance industry is also broken. The healthcare industry is broken. The education system is broken. Government is broken. Is this all part of the same problem? Or would you separate this dissatisfaction with federal government from some of these other crises?
Well, of course, each industry has its own, reasons for being broken. But the one underlying cause for all of the worst behavior that we get in, let's say, just services general, is underinvestment in IT. I think if you looked at the worst performing industries, again, education is a good example. They don't have money for good IT systems. If you look at, health insurance, and public utilities, they might have the money, but they don't have the incentives to invest in
Right.
good
And the
IT.
healthcare system is particularly astonishing. It's the only time I ever get a telephone call now is from my healthcare provider or my doctor, because they don't do online, they don't do email. So they're back in the 1990s or the 1980s when it comes to communication, which is just astonishing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they don't. Again, the incentives are just not there. The
Right.
regulations don't allow them in
Well,
some
they have a
way.
monopoly, so it doesn't. I can't go anywhere else. Nobody can go anywhere else. So coming back to this, I know you talk about in the piece a 2010 national broadband plan, which again seems like a no-brainer. Although national broadband plan now sounds rather archaic. What's happened politically? Why wasn't this plan taken up?
Well, a lot of the plan was taken up. We should say that the National Broadband Plan was very effective in terms of, a lot of its recommendations had to do with the wireless industry, which in those days was facing a real shortage of available spectrum. And one of the recommendations of the plan was to greatly increase the amount of radio frequency that was going to be available for, at that time, 4G, now 5G, and eventually 6G. And Congress did that. They set up the auctions and so on and so forth. But the chapters at the back of the plan, which talked about how to improve individual industries and particularly government services, those were completely ignored for a bunch of reasons. But I think the main reason is it's certainly not technical, and it's not even cost. It's political. If you want to close a Social Security office anywhere in this country, one thing you can be certain of is that Social Security office resides in the district of some member of Congress.
I would have thought that an e-government initiative, which makes the federal government more accountable, more efficient, more accessible, is a no-brainer. Have there been politically any initiatives over the last 20 years for what you're calling for in your Wall Street Journal op-ed?
There have been, as is typical of many government initiatives, there have been studies, there have been plans, there have been blueprints, frameworks, and so on. But there have been no serious implementation projects. Some at the federal, some at the state and local level. You can point to some interesting examples, but at the federal level, no significant systems have been implemented.
And have the Doge people picked up on it? I mean, you would have thought it would have been low-hanging fruit for them. There's a lot of controversy, particularly about Elon Musk and his involvement. But I would have thought this would have been an initiative that he would have aggressively pursued, or will aggressively pursue.
Yeah, they haven't talked about it yet. I mean, there was a couple of statements from Vijay Ramaswamy, who did say that he did note that IT systems in the federal government were extremely poor, very poor condition, and that would need to be invested in. So he at least recognized that part of any cost cutting, even budget slashing effort would require some investment, and some of that investment in IT. But that was just sort of not. And of course, they don't. That this department, which isn't really a department, we can talk about that, but it hasn't really started yet. And so we don't really know if they have any plans, will they have any plans, and what those plans are. It's so far, it's just rhetoric.
How easy would it be to implement? I mean, in terms of cost, I'm assuming that this could be done by a collection of Amazon Web Services and Google and Oracle. It wouldn't be. Would it be hard to implement?
From a technical standpoint, no, not at all. It wouldn't be technically difficult at all. From the standpoint of the bureaucracy and the regulatory structure of the federal government, it would be very difficult. The contracting cycle, for example, if you wanted to buy computer equipment, you have to go through the whole process. In many cases, request for proposal, review proposal, challenges to the winning proposal, and so on and so forth. And these things can take so long that by the time you've actually ready to let the contract go, you've had a whole new generation of technology and you just start over anyway.
Can there be any initiatives coming from Silicon Valley? We've done a number of shows last year on the way in which the Pentagon has been dragged into the future, and Silicon Valley is increasingly shaping defense industry. Palantir, other companies are more and more involved in defense procurement, for better or worse. Some people are deeply chilled by that. I mean, what companies and innovators in Silicon Valley and elsewhere could be brought into this for their own benefit?
Yeah, well, all of them, I think, is the short answer. As you mentioned, obviously all the cloud providers would stand to benefit tremendously from this, and the application developers as well. Here's a good example. I mean, we mentioned this in the piece. Something like now 90% of all tax returns are filed electronically. This has almost nothing to do with the Department of Revenue and the Internal Revenue Service. It's all Intuit. It's all TurboTax. They, for years they've been investing heavily in systems that allow you to file your taxes, to run your tax returns and so on through their application, and then file the return electronically. That's something that the federal government should have been doing, and they didn't do it. And so, this case, Intuit saw a market opportunity a long time ago and invested heavily, and now they effectively control the system that files taxes, fills out and files taxes, even though they're not a government entity. And yet, they've made a very good living handling this market, and it's so much obviously more efficient and takes so much less time. It makes perfect sense. There's no reason that other applications couldn't follow a similar model. It's not the most optimal way to solve the government problem, but it's one way.
But presumably the biggest opposition is from these bureaucrats, or at least senior bureaucrats, who are being pressured by their officers in these regional social security offices and elsewhere to keep their jobs and keep their power. Is that fair?
Yeah, as Richard Daley famously said, all politics is local. You can be as conservative as you like and say, we need to shrink the federal government, and that's fine, except when it comes to your district.
It's an absurd situation. How much would it cost then? I mean, in terms of resources, it's again relatively affordable, isn't it?
Well, it's definitely not $2 trillion or whatever the amount is that the Doge people think they can cut from the federal budget. We would certainly put some of that back into IT, but we haven't even penciled out what this would cost, but it would definitely pay for itself in a matter of a few years, if not quicker.
Yeah, I'm intrigued that the outgoing Biden administration didn't address this either. I mean, they invested trillions of dollars in the innovation economy, but left this alone. What do you make of the Biden administration's legacy when it comes to innovation?
Well, it's a mixed grade. I mean, I think the most important thing that was done, well, I should say that, but obviously the things that they did in trying to revive the American semiconductor industry, very important, but results we don't know yet. We won't know for some time. But to me, the most important initiative in the Biden administration on this front was the 2021 Bipartisan Jobs and Infrastructure Act. And among other things, this set aside $50-some billion for getting broadband connections to all the places in the United States that don't currently have it at least not at reasonable speeds, or at the speeds they now define as minimal speeds for broadband. Now, the good news is, as I say, it was $50 billion was allocated by Congress. And our study that we did during the pandemic for the National Urban League suggests that that's enough money to get a good, connection to pretty much every location in the United States that doesn't have one, except obviously the most remote places. But let's say 99.9% of locations could have good broadband for $50 billion. So that was great. The problem is, of course, almost none of that money has yet been spent. They've gone through, as I was starting to say before, this contracting process, the whole, this has been located in the Department of Commerce, and just setting up the infrastructure and then working with the states and coming up with the models, getting the proposals in, starting to review the proposals, and now starting to finally approve proposals for build out of all this new infrastructure. Is starting to happen, but it hasn't. Shovels have not gone into the ground yet.
Larry, for my last book, How to Fix the Future, I spent quite a lot of time in Estonia, which claims at least to be a major, a pioneer of e-government. And there are other countries as well. Taiwan comes to mind.
Denmark.
Are there models, in your view, in terms of e-government, in terms of streamlining, making American government more efficient, that America might emulate?
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned Estonia. I think that's a good one. Denmark is another really good one. I think pretty much.
It's always the Danes, Larry, isn't it?
Well, I would live in Copenhagen in 3 seconds if I had the opportunity, just for the coffee. But I think they're definitely, even some of the EU countries have done pieces of this. But I think if you wanted to look at countries that have done it almost completely, Estonia, of course, had, and I know this, I learned this from reading your book. Estonia had one weird advantage, which is they had no infrastructure whatsoever when the Soviets left. And so they were sort of starting with a clean slate.
And it's a small country, of course, like Denmark.
Yeah. And of course, and they don't have 50 state governments and a shared federal state power structure to deal with, at least not to the same extent that we do. So sure, we have a lot of challenges to get over. But yes, it can, again, as I say, the technical, the engineering, the computer part, this is not the hard part.
It's really astonishing that so little has been done, given the changes in the rest of the economy. But government has proved to be so, I'm not sure if this is the right word, resilient to change or resistant to change.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, part of it is the structure of the federal civil service. It is insulated in a lot of ways. And I think the incoming administration is going to learn just how insulated it is if they try to make major changes. That insulation, it's not just self-preservation in terms of the bureaucracy. In the late 19th, early 20th century, the civil service was very much affected by the change in politics. So if one, president came in with a different party, they would fire the whole federal government and rehire all their cronies to do it. And I think, as a sort of bipartisan realization in the late 19th century, this was led by Teddy Roosevelt and others, was the realization that we couldn't keep doing that we had to insulate, we had to protect the civil service so that when the government changed, we didn't have this, complete turnover and chaos that would come from starting from scratch effectively every 4 years. So the civil service is in many ways protected. That's a good thing on the one hand, but in this case, it's definitely one of the things that leads to all the intransigence.
Larry, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. I met with Max Stier. He's the founder and the president of the Partnership for Public Service. He spoke very much in defense of the value of government. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work or you saw the interview, but is there still a role for government in the 21st century, in our digital age?
Sure. Yeah. I wouldn't suggest otherwise. I hope we didn't suggest otherwise. No, look, we've made a lot of good decisions in the sense of nationalizing certain functions like Social Security, like Medicare. We value the fact that as a sort of collective action problem, one of the best ways to solve that is with government-run enterprises, government-run industries, the Postal Service, and so on and so forth. that's the right idea, and we still think it's the right idea. We just think it's just being done in such a ridiculously inefficient manner, and not making use of available tools that other people have been using since the 1980s. So yes, absolutely, lots of role for government, federal government in particular. Very valuable services that could be offered and are being offered, but are just being offered in a very ineffective and inefficient way.
Will this offer, could it offer new jobs? I mean, obviously there'll be opportunities for the cloud providers to build the infrastructure. But what about the role of AI? I know you don't really touch on it in the essay, but AI is everywhere. It's ubiquitous, for better or worse. Lots of it is overpromised, as always in these technological revolutions. But in the end, Gary Marcus was on the show a couple of days ago, who's a skeptic of AI. Even he acknowledges that AGI is inevitable. What about the fate of government in the age of AI? Is your attempt to create e-government, is that a way of ultimately protecting jobs? How could AI play a role here?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, obviously there would be many jobs, many new jobs created to build and run the e-government platforms that we're talking about. And I think a lot of the current workforce would shift from being, going to an office and either being overwhelmed with too many people or being underwhelmed with not enough people. It's sort of like the problem of retail. You either have too many or too few customers at any given time. But a lot of those people would shift to being phone support, computer support. If the system can't answer a question, or if somebody just can't figure out how to use the system, we see a strong role for better, obviously, telephone-based support, or Zoom, video-based support as well. So a lot of those people would shift to just doing similar jobs. But the base, I think the important part of this is, instead of answering the same basic, simple questions over and over again, that would be turned over to systems. And AI, I think, I agree with you. We've both been down this block many times. We know that it's being overhyped. But I think one thing that is likely is that for sort of answering very basic questions, very common questions that get asked all the time and answered all the time, AI could play a role. And that would kind of, imagine sort of skimming off the easiest kinds of service requests being handled by chatbots for those. And then that would free up the actual human civil servants to answer the more difficult questions, or to deal with the citizens who just are having trouble, just can't figure out how to use the system at all.
Are there champions within the bureaucracy itself for e-government? I mean, you and Blair Levin are writers and thinkers. Are there initiatives coming from within government? Are there reformers in DC who recognize that this needs to be done?
No. I wanted to say yes really badly, but I can't. I think the answer
Did you
is no.
talk to anyone? I mean, you have access to some of the more senior people there.
Yeah, we actually talked to a couple folks, and we talked to a former chairman of the FCC about his efforts to try and close offices during his tenure and so on. And I think what you'll find is, yes, there are certainly people, very senior people, but also people in the mid management who recognize exactly that, as you say, this is absurd, and you can't argue that the use of IT is greatly undervalued in federal government. And some of them will do, as I said, studies and frameworks and vision statements and so on and so forth. Some of them are doing that to hold off real reform, to say, look, we're making some kind of progress. Some of them genuinely wish it could happen, but I think there's an understanding within the government that big change like this just isn't possible given sort of the current political climate.
What do you mean?
Well, again, as I say, the fact that all of these services are locally placed means that no matter how conservative a member of Congress is about the idea, they might think it's a great idea. That just when sort of rubber hits the road, they don't want it to affect their districts.
But given, as you said, that only 12% of people approve of the federal government, why wouldn't this be a vote winner?
Well, you could talk. Yeah, it's a vote winner to talk about it. Improving the government, and I think that is part of what Doge is there to do, is to sort of amp up the rhetoric about how poor government service is, and sort of what a waste of money a lot of it is. But as I say, there are political and bureaucratic obstacles to moving forward that are, well, certainly that the current folks don't fully appreciate. If they actually try to do some of the things they're talking about, they will learn very quickly what can and can't be done.
Finally, Larry, there was an interesting piece a couple of days ago from a couple of guys who've been on my show, old friends of mine, Steve Hansen and Jeff Kopstein, two professors of political science, are warning that Trump is dismantling. This was in the New York Times, an op-ed. The title was "Trump is dismantling the systems that keep us safe. All Americans will suffer." What they warn about is Trump's determination, at least in their view, to create what they call a patrimonial state. They suggest it's rather like what's happening in Hungary and elsewhere, where these neo-authoritarian leaders are treating the state as if it's an extension of themselves. Do you, like Kopstein and Hansen, fear that?
Well, I think yes. I think anyone who lives in an elected democracy always fears challenges to that democracy, and it's, things are always fragile. I think, Thomas Jefferson said, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. You have to always be worried that this system of government can be dismantled. Whether this is a serious threat or not, I wouldn't say. But one of the things, obviously, that we have, that the founding fathers gave us, was a system of checks and balances and protections, and the different branches of government. And it'll be interesting to see, particularly, how the judiciary would respond, for example, if extrajudicial activities were taking place. People will obviously, bring lawsuits. They will find their way through the federal court system. And it would be interesting to see where the conservative members of the Supreme Court, for example, what does conservative really mean? Does it mean conserving the system that was in place and so on, or does it mean bowing to the will of the current administration? Again, this is if that actually happens. But we do have protections that, let's say, as you mentioned, Hungary doesn't have, and a lot of countries that have gone down this route did not have the kind of judiciary that we have in terms of its constitutional role. And I think that's where the rubber would meet the road.
Well, let me revise the question. Perhaps e-government is the best protection against this slide into what Kopstein and Hansen warn as patrimonialism, a reversion to some sort of monarchical system under neo-authoritarian leaders like Trump.
Well, that's interesting. I certainly hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right. I mean, once something is systematized, once it's in an IT system, it's much harder to make a phone call and say, I want you to do X for Y, even whether it's legal or not. It's much harder to tell a computer system to break its own rules if that's the case. So yeah, I think the more something is systematized, the more it's put into code. It's not impossible to break it, but it's harder to break it.
Well, Larry, only 12% of Americans approve of the federal government. They're all dissatisfied. Is there more than a 12% chance that this e-government initiative under Trump and this Doge initiative will happen, or would you say it's less than 1 in 10?
As you well know, Andrew, I'm not a betting man. I wouldn't give odds. I think, as I say, there are profound obstacles to getting this done, which are not technical. On the other hand, 12% satisfaction of service level is a strong incentive, and it remains to be seen if anyone with authority is going to pick up this baton and run with it. As you say, it could be a vote getter. It could be something that happens in Congress. It could be something that happens in the administration. We'll have to wait and see. We will.
2025 is supposed to be a tumultuous year. at least according to the Washington Post. It may not be quite as tumultuous when it comes to e-government reform, at least according to Larry Downs, but he believes it should happen, and I think it's a no-brainer. Who indeed does need 1,000 Social Security offices? Larry, as always, will talk again in the new year. Well, the new year's already arrived. We'll talk again later in the year to see when there really is any innovation behind the new Trump administration. Thank you so much, and a happy and healthy new year.